When I signed the lease for my new home in the sleepy suburban cul-de-sac, I was over the moon. The neighborhood was a postcard of quaint perfection: manicured lawns, white picket fences, children riding bikes in lazy circles under the watchful eyes of smiling parents. My little house was a dream, a cozy two-bedroom with a wraparound porch, a rosebush out front, and a backyard shaded by towering oaks. I spent the first day unpacking, humming to myself as I arranged books on shelves and hung pictures on the walls, savoring the fresh start after years in a noisy city apartment. That's when I first noticed Mr. Hargrove, the old man next door. His house stood in stark contrast to the rest of the street, a dilapidated relic with cracked windows, peeling gray paint, and a jungle of tangled weeds that seemed to choke the life out of the foundation. He was there as I carried in my last box, standing at his front window, his skeletal frame outlined against the grimy glass. His head was cocked slightly, and his eyes, sunken and unblinking, tracked me as I moved from car to porch and back again. I paused mid-step, clutching a lamp, and offered a hesitant wave, expecting a nod or a smile in return. Nothing. He just stared, his expression blank, his hands hanging limp at his sides. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just a lonely old man with nothing better to do, but the next day, he was there again. And the day after that. Every time I stepped outside, to sweep the porch, check the mailbox, or water the roses, his face was pressed to that window, watching me with an intensity that made my scalp tingle. It wasn't casual curiosity, it was deliberate, almost predatory. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I caught a glint of something in his hands. Binoculars. He was holding binoculars, the lenses trained directly on me as I locked my car. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out on my neck. I hurried inside, slamming the door behind me, and yanked the blinds shut on every window. But even with the curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the sensation that his eyes were still on me, boring through the walls, mapping my every move. I started sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every creak of the house settling, wondering if he was still out there, watching. The tapping started about a week later, and it turned my unease into full-blown dread. It was subtle at first, late at night, when the neighborhood was silent except for the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. I'd be drifting off to sleep, cocooned in blankets, when I'd hear it, tap, tap tap, tap. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like someone brushing their knuckles against the glass of my bedroom window. I'd sit up, heart hammering against my ribs, and strain my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound was irregular, not the steady rhythm of a branch scraping in the wind, but erratic, intentional. I'd creep to the window, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and ease the blinds apart just enough to peek into the darkness. The yard was always empty, nothing but shadows swaying in the breeze, the faint gleam of moonlight on the grass, and the hulking silhouette of Mr. Hargrove's house next door, its windows black and lifeless. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that old houses made noises, that I was just jumpy from the move. But the tapping persisted, night after night, sometimes on the bedroom window, sometimes on the living room, once even on the back door. I bought heavy curtains, thinking they'd muffle the sound or at least give me some peace of mind, but it only made it worse. I'd lie awake, imagining what might be out there, unseen, waiting. Then came the night of the storm. It rolled in unexpectedly, a late summer squall that turned the sky bruise purple and unleashed torrents of rain that battered the roof like fists. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I was in the kitchen, making tea to calm my nerves, when the power went out with a soft pop, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight beam trembling in my shaky hand, when I heard it, a low, raspy hum, barely audible over the howling wind. It wasn't mechanical, not like a generator or a car engine, it was human, guttural, rising and falling like a chant. I froze, the teakettle slipping from my fingers to clatter into the sink. The sound was coming from outside, close, too close. I edged toward the living room window, my breath shallow, and parted the curtains with one trembling finger. Lightning flashed, illuminating the backyard in stark white, and there he was, Mr. Hargrove, standing in the pouring rain, his thin frame hunched against the downpour. He was motionless, his sodden clothes clinging to his bony limbs, his head tilted up toward my bedroom window on the second floor. His mouth was open, and I realized with a jolt that the humming was coming from him, a low, eerie drone that vibrated through the glass. Another flash of lightning, and for a split second, his eyes seemed to glow, unnaturally white, like twin moons in his skull. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat, and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The police arrived 20 minutes later, their flashlights cutting through the storm, but by then, he was gone. His house stood dark and silent, the front door locked, the windows empty. They told me it was probably just a prank, that the rain must have distorted what I saw, but I knew better. I didn't sleep that night, sitting on the couch with a kitchen knife clutched in my lap, listening for that hum to return. The next morning, as the storm clouds parted and weak sunlight filtered through the trees, I found something that turned my fear into terror. Slipped under my front door was a soggy envelope, its edges curling from the damp. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the paper cold and clammy against my skin. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph, creased and slightly blurry from the rain. It showed me, asleep in my bed, my face peaceful, my chest rising and falling under the blankets. The angle was from above, slightly off-center, as if someone had stood over me, holding the camera just inches from my body. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. Someone had been inside my house, inside my bedroom, while I slept, defenseless. I checked the locks, the windows, every possible entry point, but nothing was broken, nothing out of place. I called the police again, my voice shaking as I handed over the photo, and they promised to investigate. That night, I installed a cheap security camera from the hardware store, mounting it on the porch to face the front door. I barely slept, replaying the image in my mind, imagining the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the floorboards under an intruder's weight. At dawn, I checked the footage. At 3:14 a.m., the grainy black and white video showed Mr. Hargrove stepping onto my porch. He moved slowly, deliberately, his head bowed as if to hide his face from the camera. In his hand was a key, small, silver, glinting faintly in the moonlight. He approached the door, inserted the key into the lock, and turned it. The mechanism clicked, but he didn't push the door open. Instead, he froze, his hand still on the knob, and slowly raised his head to stare directly into the camera. His lips stretched into a grin, too wide, too unnatural, showing teeth that gleamed like wet bone. He held the pose for a full 10 seconds before stepping back, pocketing the key, and vanishing into the shadows. I called the police immediately, and this time, they took it seriously. They searched his house that afternoon while I watched from my porch, my arms wrapped tight around myself. What they found still haunts me. In his basement, hidden behind a false wall, was a shrine of sorts, dozens of Polaroids pinned to a corkboard, each one time-stamped and labeled with names. There were pictures of me, sleeping, cooking, reading on the couch, alongside shots of other neighbors, some I recognized, some I didn't. The dates went back years, long before I'd moved in. But the worst discovery came when they pried open a trapdoor beneath the basement stairs. It led to a narrow crawlspace, damp and reeking of mildew, where they found a rusted metal box. Inside were locks, old, tarnished locks, and a ring of keys, each tagged with addresses from the neighborhood. One of them, the police confirmed, matched my front door perfectly. Mr. Hargrove was gone by then, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a house full of secrets and a key that still sits in my drawer, a cold reminder that he, or someone, could come back any night. Moving into my new apartment was a relief after months of searching, a third-floor unit in an old brick building downtown, with high ceilings, exposed pipes, and a view of the bustling street below. The rent was suspiciously low, but I figured it was just the quirks of an aging structure, creaky floors, drafty windows, the occasional groan of the radiator kicking on. I settled in quickly, unpacking my sparse belongings, books, a laptop, a few framed photos, and spent the first few nights enjoying the hum of city life filtering through the glass. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just faint scratches, like tiny claws skittering inside the walls. I'd hear it late at night, lying in bed with the lights off, the sound drifting from somewhere behind the headboard. It was subtle enough that I could dismiss it as mice. Old buildings always had pests, right? I mentioned it to my landlord, a gruff man with a perpetual cigarette dangling from his lip, and he waved me off with a grunt. Mice, probably. Traps are in the basement if you want 'em. I set a few traps with peanut butter, but nothing ever took the bait, and the scratching didn't stop. Over the next few days, it grew louder, more insistent, echoing from different spots, behind the kitchen cabinets one night, near the bathroom sink the next. I started sleeping with earplugs, but even then, I could feel the vibrations through the mattress, a faint tremor that set my nerves on edge. Then, one evening, as I sat on the couch watching TV, the scratching turned into something else, a slow, deliberate thump, like someone tapping a fist against the plaster. It came from the wall behind me, steady and rhythmic, thump, 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 before stopping abruptly. I muted the TV, my heart pounding, and waited. Silence. Just as I convinced myself it was nothing, a whisper slithered through the wall, soft, garbled, like words spoken underwater. I leapt up, pressing my ear to the cold surface, but it was gone. The next night, it happened again, only this time, the whisper was followed by a muffled laugh, low and guttural, that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I banged on the wall, shouting for it to stop, but the sound only grew louder, more mocking, until it faded into the night. I didn't sleep, sitting upright with every light blazing, wondering what, or who, was on the other side. The noises became a nightly torment, and I started dreading sundown. The thumping grew heavier, like boots stomping on wood, and the whispers sharpened into fragments of words, "Here, watch, soon," spoken in a raspy voice that sounded too close, too real. I called the landlord again, practically begging him to check the walls, but he laughed it off. "Pipes," he said. "Old pipes make all kinds of racket. You'll get used to it." I didn't believe him. I started mapping the sounds, pressing a glass to the walls like a makeshift stethoscope, tracing their path. They seemed to come from the direction of the vacant apartment next door, Unit 3B, which had been empty since I moved in, or so I'd been told. One afternoon, I knocked on 3B's door, just to see. No answer, but as I stood there, I heard it, a faint shuffle, like someone shifting their weight on the other side. I backed away, my pulse racing, and decided to investigate further. That night, armed with a flashlight and a screwdriver, I pried off the vent cover in my bedroom, the one closest to the shared wall. The beam revealed a dusty metal duct, narrow and rusted, stretching into darkness. I leaned in, holding my breath, and listened. At first, nothing, just the distant drip of water somewhere in the building. Then, a creak, followed by a long, slow exhale that wasn't mine. I jerked back, dropping the flashlight, and scrambled to screw the vent back on with shaking hands. The next day, I went to the landlord's office in the basement, demanding answers. He was there, hunched over a ledger, and barely looked up as I ranted about the noises, the vent, the empty apartment. Finally, he sighed, stubbed out his cigarette, and muttered, "Look, 3BS not empty. Guy's been there for years. Keeps to himself. Pays cash. You're fine." My jaw dropped. Who? I've never seen anyone. He shrugged, avoiding my eyes. Some people don't want to be seen. That night, the noises changed again. The thumping stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scratching, metal on metal, coming from the vent. I grabbed my phone to record it, and as the sound grew louder, I heard something else, a faint tapping on my front door. I crept to the peephole, expecting an empty hallway, but instead, I saw a shadow, just a sliver, shifting slightly, like someone standing just out of view. The tapping stopped, and the shadow vanished, but the scratching in the vent didn't. It went on for hours, relentless, until I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, clutching a baseball bat. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I marched to the hardware store and bought a cheap nanny cam, the kind with motion detection and night vision. I set it up facing the vent, its tiny green light blinking in the corner of my bedroom, and waited. All day, I paced the apartment, jumping at every creak, every honk from the street below. By midnight, I was a wreck, sitting cross-legged on the bed with my laptop open, streaming the camera feed live. For hours, nothing, just the dim outline of my room, the vent cover still in place, the faint hum of the city outside. I started to doze off, my head nodding forward, when the screen flickered. The timestamp jumped, 2:47 a.m., and the vent cover was gone. My breath caught as I stared at the feed, adrenaline flooding my system. The duct opening gaped like a black maw, and then, slowly, something emerged. A hand, pale, bony, with long, cracked nails, slid out, gripping the edge of the wall. It was followed by another, and then a head, matted hair, wild and gray, framing a face I couldn't fully see in the shadows. The figure paused, half in, half out, and turned toward the camera. Two pinpoints of light glinted where eyes should have been, reflecting the infrared glow, and a wide, toothless grin spread across the face. I screamed, slamming the laptop shut, and grabbed the bat, swinging at the vent before I even realized what I was doing. The metal crumpled under the blow, and a low, guttural laugh echoed from inside, not from the figure on the screen, but from the wall itself, vibrating through the room. I bolted out of the apartment, barefoot and sobbing, and didn't stop until I reached the street. The police came an hour later, skeptical but willing to check. They found the vent cover on the floor, the duct empty, and no sign of anyone in 3B. The landlord swore the tenant had moved out months ago, contradicting his earlier story, and showed them the vacant unit, dusty, bare, with no furniture or belongings. But when I showed them the nanny cam footage, saved to my phone, their faces paled. The video cut off after the grin, but the audio kept going, 5 minutes of that same guttural laugh, overlaid with a whispered chant, "I see you, I see you, I see you." They searched the building top to bottom and found a hidden access panel in 3BS closet, leading to a network of crawlspaces between the walls. Inside were scraps of food, torn clothes, and a pile of scratched-up Polaroids, pictures of me, taken through the vent, my sleeping face illuminated by a flash. The tenant, whoever he was never found, but I moved out that week. The last night, as I packed my car, I heard it one more time, a faint tap, tap tap, tap, coming from the empty apartment above. I'd always wanted to live in the country, so when I found the rental cottage on the edge of a sprawling field, I jumped at it. It was a quaint little place, stone walls, a pitched roof, a porch with a rocking chair, surrounded by wildflowers and the endless stretch of tall grass that swayed like an ocean in the wind. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, a farmhouse barely visible across the field, its lights twinkling faintly at night. I loved the isolation at first, spending my days writing and my evenings sipping tea on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. But about a week in, I started noticing something odd. Every night, around 11 p.m., the lights in the farmhouse would flicker, not just dim or brighten, but pulse in a strange, uneven rhythm, like a heartbeat. I'd squint through the darkness, trying to make sense of it, but the distance made it impossible to tell if it was intentional or just faulty wiring. Then, one night, as I watched from the porch, the lights went out completely. I shrugged, assuming a power outage, and turned to go inside when they flared back on, brighter than ever, and stayed that way for a solid minute before winking out again. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. The next night, it happened again, only this time, I heard something, a faint, high-pitched whine, like feedback from a radio, drifting across the field. I grabbed my binoculars, a leftover from my birdwatching days, and trained them on the farmhouse. The windows were dark, the house still, but just as I lowered the lenses, a single light snapped on in an upstairs room, and I swore I saw a silhouette, tall, thin, motionless, staring back at me. My hands shook as I set the binoculars down, telling myself it was just my imagination, but I locked the door that night for the first time since moving in. The flickering lights became a ritual I couldn't ignore, and the whine grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was burrowing into my skull. I started keeping a journal, logging the times and patterns, hoping to find some logic in it. 11:03 p.m., 3 pulses, off for 10 seconds, back on for 5. But the more I watched, the more I noticed other things. Footprints appeared in the field one morning, deep, uneven tracks that started halfway across and stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. They were too big to be mine, the toes splayed unnaturally wide, and they pointed toward my cottage. I called the property manager, a cheerful woman named Linda, and she laughed it off. "Probably deer," she said. "They roam out there all the time. But deer don't leave human-shaped prints, and they don't stop dead in the middle of a field." A few nights later, I woke to the sound of rustling, dry grass crunching underfoot, right outside my bedroom window. I lay still, barely breathing, as the sound circled the house, slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps. I wanted to look, but fear glued me to the bed, my mind racing with images of that silhouette from the farmhouse. The rustling stopped eventually, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to wake at dawn to find more footprints, this time circling the cottage, inches from the walls, with a single handprint pressed into the mud beneath my window. It was long and thin, the fingers stretched like they'd been pulled taut. I drove to town that day, desperate for answers, and asked around at the general store. An old man behind the counter froze when I mentioned the farmhouse. "Ain't nobody lived there in years," he said, his voice low. "Owner disappeared back in '98. Folks say it's cursed, lights come on by themselves, weird noises. You best stay clear." I nodded, pretending to brush it off, but my gut twisted as I drove home, the farmhouse's lights pulsing in the distance like a beacon. I stopped sleeping after that, surviving on coffee and paranoia. The lights across the field grew erratic, flashing in bursts, staying on for hours, then going dark for days. The whining sound turned into a low hum, constant and maddening, vibrating through the walls even in daylight. I bought a shotgun from a pawn shop, more for peace of mind than anything else, and kept it loaded by the door. One night, as a thick fog rolled in and swallowed the field, the lights didn't flicker, they burned steady, a sickly yellow glow that cut through the haze. The hum was louder than ever, a deep drone that rattled the windows, and I gripped the gun, pacing the living room. Then I heard it, footsteps, heavy and uneven, crunching through the grass. They were coming closer, not circling this time, but heading straight for the cottage. I flicked off the lights, plunging the house into darkness, and peered through the front window. The fog was too thick to see far, but the footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a wet, rasping breath that sent ice down my spine. Something scraped against the porch, a long, slow drag, like nails on wood, and the doorknob jiggled, once, twice, then stopped. I held my breath, finger on the trigger, as a shadow loomed against the glass, tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The hum spiked, deafening, and the shadow pressed closer, its outline sharpening into something not quite human, limbs too long, fingers splayed like branches. I fired through the door, the blast shattering the silence, and the shadow recoiled, the hum cutting off abruptly. I stumbled back, ears ringing, and waited, but nothing moved. At dawn, I checked outside. The porch was empty, no blood, no body, just a single footprint in the dirt, deeper than the others, with claw-like gouges where toes should have been. The farmhouse lights were off that night, and every night after. I moved out a week later, leaving the cottage and its secrets behind, but I still dream of that hum, and sometimes, in the quiet, I swear I hear footsteps in the grass.